Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Candace Bond-Theriault, Senior Director of Policy at the Black Women's Health Imperative and an adjunct professor of sociology and criminology at Howard University. Candace is an experienced social justice lawyer with a demonstrated history of working in the political and civil rights industry. She works through a Black queer feminist lens to create change and shift culture towards intersectional liberation. She's the author of Queering Reproductive Justice, An Invitation, published in 2024. On March 4th, 2025, Candace will deliver the 2024-25 O'Fallon Memorial Lecture titled Queering Reproductive Justice, An Invitation to Create Our Collective Future. Her talk is part of the Oregon Humanities Center 2024-25 themed speaker series on the topic of reimagine. Candace, thank you for coming on the show. And I have to say that I realized when I was coming into the office this morning that it's actually Audre Lorde's birthday. And that seems like an especially propitious day to record an interview with you. So I'm going to start off by saying, hey, happy Audre Lorde Day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm really appreciative of you having me here and being able to talk about what intersectional liberation looks like in a moment that we are in right now. And I also just want to note that I'm doing this in my personal capacity as we go forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that note. Tell us about your background and what led to your work in law and social justice.
Yeah, so I'm a Virginian, born and raised, born in Southern Virginia, right on the North Carolina line. And so for me, civil rights and social justice was just always a part of my story, always a part of my upbringing. My parents are still very active in voter registration and voting rights. And I got to skip school and go vote with them. And they would take me to the voting booth, even from a very small age, and just really taught me about the importance of casting a ballot and voting and participating in our democracy. So they really taught me about voting rights and education and the importance of education and being informed about the world around you. And so I really had no choice. Either I was going to embrace it and go and continue to be a social justice and civil rights advocate or not. And I did. So I embraced it and I decided to go to law school to study constitutional law and gender in specific, because for me, really focusing on the intersection of Black womanhood and even more specifically Black queer womanhood and the law is just an area that is not getting enough focus, has never gotten enough focus. And so for me, leaning into those intersections and shedding some light into some space that doesn't really get light shown on it enough is really important. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from those intersectional areas of both law and policy and culture. So for me, it's both a professional pursuit, but also a personal pursuit of making sure that the Black queer feminist perspective is included in these larger conversations.
Yes, thank you for that. And I noticed in the book how carefully you lead us toward discovering that. So your reader, you sort of start by introducing terms and then you guide your reader to seeing, oh my goodness, so many horizons open up once I adopt that perspective. So it's really successful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wanted to write something as an invitation and not as a mandate or, femifesto, if you will, but an invitation to join in a movement that already exists in the world. I did not create the movement. I did not found the movement. I'm a part of the movement. And so it's an invitation for others to join in this work as well. And so I wanted to create it in this accessible, come join us, instead of an inaccessible, this like us and them perspective, in order to really movement build. This book is a movement building book, and so I wrote it with the intention of movement building with the reader as they read the book.
What are the core values of the reproductive justice movement?
So there are just, I mean, there are so many. There are, of course, the four tenets of reproductive justice: the right to have a child, to not have a child, to parent the children that we have in safe and healthy environments, and the right to bodily autonomy are the core tenets of reproductive justice. But the values of reproductive justice are all about collective liberation and family, making sure that we're family and community and humanity, that we're all together and we're moving together towards a vision where not necessarily a utopic future, because there's also a lot of realism and pragmatism in reproductive justice. Like utopia is a cute, nice vision, but what is the reality? What are the things that we actually need that we can really thrive and survive together? And so for me, reproductive justice, the value is really about the thriving piece. Like, what does thriving look like? What does it mean to thrive and have access to unlimited food, but in a way that isn't wasteful? What does it look like to have access to clean air in a place that's it's shared with others? Like, it's about community, and it's about making sure that we all have the ability to really dream and create a vision for ourselves with others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes great sense. Thank you for that. Some people frame their ideas about reproductive rights in terms of speaking of being pro-choice. But what do you find to be problematic or lacking in that term?
Only some people have choices. Not everyone has a choice. And so to frame a movement in a choice versus not choice framework is already going to be problematic from the beginning. And so what we know is that people who identify as people of color, people who identify as queer or trans or gender nonconforming, have less choices in the healthcare that they're able to access, have less choices in the housing that they're able to gain access to, have less choices in educational pursuits, in jobs and employment. We're still working towards protections, especially in this moment where a lot of the protections that were won during the 1960s civil rights era are being eroded daily. We recognize just how important these protections have been, and how, whether some, people can make an argument that some of them have been taken for granted, but a lot of them haven't. A lot of times people have been fighting to continually expand and protect these rights ever since they were won. And so for me, it's about that. It's about making sure that we continue that work. So the choice framework, I think, is just very limiting, and it's more in the reproductive, I'm going to put in air quotes for folks who are listening to this, in the reproductive rights field versus the reproductive justice field, which looks beyond choice and is about access.
I was also interested in an argument you were making for the right to not have children, which I also thought sort of helped expand um, sort of the purview of those possibilities.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important, particularly at a moment when the maternal mortality rate for Black women, particularly Black women in the South, is 3 times as high for their white counterparts. Having a child in this country is very risky, especially in today as we're speaking. We don't know what's going to be happening with health, with vaccinations, with all these things that are needed to raise children and to healthy adulthoods. We don't know if those things are going to be accessible at a critical time in our country. And so having children is incredibly risky. And so if folks don't want to have children, they should have the right to not have children.
How does reproductive justice use intersectional analysis to address inequities? I think you began to talk about this a little bit just a few minutes ago, but could you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in a law review article that she wrote. And she very much talks about how she did not create the theory of intersectionality, but instead coined a term to really explain what it means to live at the intersections in her article of Black womanhood. But we're all intersectional. We all have our own ethnicities, our own gender identities, our own socioeconomic statuses that shift. So there's intersectionality and it's always shifting, and power dynamics come in and shift things around even more. But for me, intersectionality is a part of reproductive justice because you can't really do a reproductive justice analysis without considering the intersections. You can't only have, in my opinion, feminist liberation. Because what does that mean? Like part of the people that are being liberated are going to be Black women, are going to be brown women, are going to be queer women, are going to also be men, right? That are going to be liberated when you're talking about feminist liberation. So you have to look at the intersections and consider the intersections. Otherwise, a lot of the identities that tend to be made to be more marginalized, it's easier for them to become erased if you're not considering an intersectional analysis, which I just find to be incredibly important. And I also talked to my students about this every semester, that intersectionality is kind of the start of a larger analysis of that reproductive justice brings. And one of the second pieces, so you have intersectionality is the first part of the framework, and the second part of the framework is really looking at power, privilege, and oppression. And so once you've named and identified intersections and those identities, then you have to look at the privilege. What identities are more likely to experience privilege? Which identities are more likely to experience systems of oppression? And then who has the power in that dynamic, and or what institution has the power in that dynamic? And then you actually get a bigger sense and at the same time, a bigger and more detailed sense of the problem that you have at hand versus just looking through a singular intersectionality lens.
Thank you. I think that's really illuminating. When we began talking, you spoke of working from a Black queer perspective, a Black queer feminist perspective, and I was interested if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the unique challenges that LGBTQIA plus people face.
Yeah, well, you started this interview to congratulate me and wishing me a happy Audre Lorde birthday. And so for me, Audre Lorde is one of the quintessential Black queer feminists. And although she would not have identified as queer, she identified as a lesbian poet, warrior woman. Um, to me, her writing really embodies this intersection of Black queer feminism in a way that others as well, like Barbara Jordan, Lorraine Hansberry. There's so many, so many. I mean, we could have an entire conversation of Black queer feminism. And for me, Black queer feminism is about doing the work in a way that illuminates a particular intersection in order to not only just shed light on that intersection, but to shed light on broader issues. And so a Black queer feminist issue when it comes to reproductive justice, an example would be abortion. So abortion or contraception or IVF, you really could take any reproductive health issue and look at it through a queering reproductive justice lens. So thinking about who's missing from this analysis? What is missing from this analysis? LGBTQ folks of color need access to abortions too. But if all the data is only focused on women without defining what they mean by quote unquote women, are we missing LGBTQ people? Are they already included in that data set? So data, I think, is a huge barrier to really understanding what LGBTQ folks of color need in reproductive health, because data is not usually disaggregated. Sometimes it's disaggregated by race. Sometimes it's disaggregated by gender and gender identity, but oftentimes it's not disaggregated by both. And I think some of the disparities that we know of within the queer community isn't represented in the data that we see. And so a queer and reproductive justice analysis would argue for the disaggregation of that data in order to actually have a fuller picture on the reproductive health needs of LGBTQ people of color.
Thanks. Your book balances a clear-eyed analysis of state oppression and systemic institutionalized power imbalances with a strong current of positivity and the idea that we can parent ourselves into creating a better, more just world that is safe for many more people. These days can really challenge that optimism, as we were talking about a little bit before we started. How is the reproduction justice movement responding to actions being taken by the new administration?
That's a great question and a huge question that I cannot really respond to based on the organizational levels. I will speak from myself that we're in challenging times. I think it's at this point, it's very precedented to say we live in unprecedented times. We live in challenging times, and they're going to become more challenging before they become less challenging. And I think that's just something that we have to accept. Angela Davis's book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, is a great reminder. I feel like that phrase, that title of the book, that freedom is a constant struggle, is just really accurate on the moment that we're in. But I also like to give a little bit of a caveat to it that freedom is a constant struggle, but it doesn't have to be constant. You can take a break here and there. You can take a week. You can take a day. Take 5 minutes between your meetings. Drink some water. Like being constant is really relative. So I think defining what that means for you is important to help you stay a little bit, to help myself, I'll speak for myself, to stay a little bit more optimistic. And then the freedom is a constant struggle. Yes, it's a struggle, but everything worthwhile is difficult. Like nothing is like things aren't easy. I have a 3-year-old and I keep trying to tell him like life is hard. Like things are just not easy. We don't always just get our way. You want to try something and he's learning to write his name and he's learning how to do things, and it's hard. This is hard work. Things are difficult. But then you're going to write your name, and then, in a few months, you'll be able to write it so quickly. It'll become very easy. You will no longer struggle at the thing that you once struggled at. So I think the struggle will definitely exist and continue, but I think it's all relative. And so for me, optimism, like I have to ground myself in optimism because I have no choice. Like I don't have a choice I can't just fall into fatalism and pessimism because I have to do the work. I have kids. I have another generation to care for. I have parents. I have people that I care about. I care about myself. And so I have to continue to find moments of optimism because it's also part of resistance, right? Like self-preservation. And Audre Lorde has a really famous quote saying that resistance and rest is not just mere preservation, self-preservation, but it's an act of political warfare. And I completely agree with that. Like even your 5 minutes today, as you're listening to this, and taking 5 minutes after listening to this podcast to just rest and take some breaths and drink some water and get up from your seat and walk around your space, like that counts. Like that's grounding. That's something that people are trying to take away from you. They're trying to make it so that you don't feel like you can have 5 minutes, but you do. And that's where a lot of your power lies in this moment.
That's such a great answer. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Candace Bond-Theriault, the author of Queering Reproductive Justice, An Invitation. On March 4th, 2025, Candace will give a lecture titled Queering Reproductive Justice, An Invitation to Create Our Collective Future, as the 2024-25 O'Fallon Memorial Lecture. Her talk will be part of the Oregon Humanities Center 24-25 themed speaker series on the topic of reimagine. Candace, we so look forward to your lecture, and thank you again for appearing on UO today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our research notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student research. In this episode, Dr. Judith Raiskin and Linda Long talk about Outliers and Outlaws, the Eugene Lesbian History Project. Judith is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Oregon. Some of the work she did on the Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project was supported by an OHC Faculty Research Fellowship, which she held over the 2020 academic year. Linda is the curator of manuscripts at the University of Oregon Libraries. Judith and Linda, welcome. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How would you each describe your research focus?
This is Linda, and my job is to work with donors to acquire new collections for research in special collections and university archives. So I work here in Knight Library with a very talented group of archivists to acquire those collections, make them available for research, and then scholars come into special collections to do their research on the collections in our reading room here in Knight Library.
And I teach in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and I teach courses in archival research with Linda Long. I teach disability studies, LGBTQ history, and literature.
And tell us, what is the Outliers and Outlaws Eugene Lesbian History Project?
Well, we had the idea to document the history of the longtime lesbian community in Eugene. When I first came to work here at the university in 1996, I noticed early on that there was a really deep and rich community here in Eugene. And so for the longest time, I thought it would be really important to document this history. And I thought, what better way to do it than to conduct an oral history project and interview these individual women, make those videos and the transcriptions of the audio portion of the interviews available for research.
So we put the word out to the community of who would like to come in and be interviewed. And we were gratified that a couple hundred people came onto our list. And we had orientation sessions where we talked to them about what it meant to tell their stories. I'm a person who's interested in narratives and stories. And so I thought, well, I'll be a good person to interview these people. And people came with boxes of material, things that they had been hanging on to because they knew it was important, but they didn't know what to do with it. And we said we'd be really happy to accept these things. So these include diaries and letters and business records, T-shirts and buttons, political organizing, all kinds of materials from the 70s, 80s, 90s that we have now been able to archive, and people can come into the archives and use those for research. We brought people in and told them what was going to happen, and then one by one, in the summers of 2018 and 2019, we interviewed 2 to 3 people a day in 1 to 2 hour interviews in the studio in Knight Library. And they're really very wonderful interviews. They tell people's life stories, focusing on different things. At some point in the interview, we would say, "And how did you get to Eugene?" And then they would tell their story about the really vibrant community that they created here in Eugene, creating collective businesses and restaurants and sports teams and cultural dance troupes and theater troupes, and that went all over the country. And so at one point, Eugene had the highest per capita lesbian population of any city in the country. And so we knew that this was a really vibrant history that needed to be preserved and that people would have access to them. So all along, our goal was to collect and preserve this history, but then also to make it as accessible as possible. T. Corinne, who was an artist and photographer here in Oregon, said that
the lack of an accessible history is a devastating form of oppression, and lesbians face it constantly. So she was, in her own research, in T. Corinne's own research, she realized that it was very hard to find primary sources about lesbians' lives. And, families would burn letters in shame, or others would not recognize the importance of somebody's own personal history and destroy them indiscriminately. So we kept that quote to heart when we did the oral history project. And I would say Judith and I have this really wonderful working relationship. I'm the archivist, so I have the capacity in the library to use facilities here and the support of the libraries to conduct the interview. And she's the scholar. She can ask all the pertinent questions and elicit all these really marvelous, really rich answers to these questions. So, what we end up with is just this marvelous collection that's now accessible for research. From now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, this collection will be available for research.
And we also wanted it to be available to anybody, anybody with a computer or a phone can watch these interviews. They are searchable by word. We had them transcribed. And so people can do research. They can find, the subject that they're interested in, and just those interviews will come up because it's a lot of footage. It's 2 hours each for 83 narrators. It is the largest filmed and accessible lesbian archive in the world at the moment. I think that's going to change because people are realizing that this is a generation that's passing. This is the first generation that lived out and built communities around being out. And so I think lots of places are recording these oral histories now. We really want to make them accessible. So the next thing that we did with them was we created a website called Outliers and Outlaws, and collaborated with a film team called Boxcar Assembly, and sampled from all 83 of the interviews to tell particular stories in these composite videos about different subjects, 23 different subjects that the narrators speak to in a really beautiful arc in each one of conversation around these topics, from very personal identity issues about how they understand themselves to political issues that had national influence to the actual things that they did in Eugene, which were phenomenal. So those are really beautiful to watch, and they're all in segments, and we've digitized many hundreds of photographs. So there's a digital exhibit of the photographs. There's no stock photographs in this website. It's all the material that the narrators brought to us. And from there, we worked on a documentary, which has just come out. It's also called Outliers and Outlaws, and it focuses on 9 of the 83 narrators, and it tells the story of lesbian Eugene. And it is, we just had the Eugene premiere in Straub Hall, 520 seats were all full with overflowing. It was a wonderful time. And at the Art House, it's going to be February 28th to March 3rd. There's different shows that are up. 3 of them have already sold out, maybe 4. So if anybody's interested and you want to see this show, you should buy your tickets now online at the Eugene Art House.
Fantastic. You've touched on this obliquely as you've been talking, but I'd sort of like to return to the question of the significance of this project. According to each of you, what makes the work you do with this project important to humanity?
Well, of course, the project documents an important history that otherwise would really be lost. We might have collected some narrators' personal papers, but this project kind of brings it all together. And there's so many, as Professor Raiskin said, so many wonderful stories that talk about life in Eugene in the 70s and 80s and 90s, about art and culture created by the community, just the joys of living in the community, the struggle for civil rights. By doing this project, we've ensured that story is told, and the many stories that are told by these lesbians.
And the story isn't just in the past, it's important the present. And I think the heart of this project all along has been intergenerational conversation between the narrators and the people of the generation of the 1970s and 80s and 90s and young people today. And at the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, we had a number of intergenerational meetups of people to talk about how they see things now. We're facing some political struggles that are similar in some ways to what we faced in the 80s and 90s. And there are some models of courage and how to live in joy during hard times that I think young people can benefit from now. This is a reflection of a generation to itself, but it's also a window for other people to see what that history was and then to see themselves using that as a basis for going forward in their own lives in the ways things are different and yet similar, and to support each other across generations.
That's really wonderful. I love the idea of the mirror and the window.
Mm-hmm.
So where can people who seek to look in the mirror and look through the window, where can they learn more about the Outliers and Outlaws Eugene Lesbian History Project?
The archives themselves are available on Oregon Digital. Linda, why don't you talk about how to get to the catalog about that, how people can see it?
Somebody can just simply search the University of Oregon Library's catalog. Just search Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project, or just Lesbian Oral History Project. The catalog record comes up. You can click then on the link to the finding aid. And then once you're in the online finding aid, you can click on individual interviews. Then there's also the website, and the website also provides access to the actual interviews.
So that website is Outliers and Outlaws, and you can see across the top there's a space to look at how to get to the archives themselves, how to use the archives, and a page on the documentary to see where the documentary is being shown now, and a lot of the wonderful response that's coming about the documentary. And I do want to do a shout out to the filmmakers that we worked with. Their company is called Boxcar Assembly, and it's Courtney Herman and Carrie Beth Elliott, and a producer, G. Chesler. And they did such a beautiful job making this work and these archives accessible to everybody in absolutely the most gorgeous way.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show to talk about this a little bit. I have been speaking with Dr. Judith Raiskin from the UO's Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Linda Long, the curator of manuscripts at the University of Oregon Libraries, about Outliers and Outlaws, the Eugene Lesbian History Project. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.